The Last Day by Bedtime Horror. This is the end. Nothing matters anymore. The earth, the cradle that protected us since before our existence, has now fallen into a direct course towards the sun. In a single day, more than 10,000 years of history will be wiped out. All because our arrogant scientists could not contain their curiosity. They drove their questions as to why beyond where any practical application could have come from. A month ago, at CERN, they conducted a new innovative test to see whether some connection could possibly be made between certain forces that may or may not be at play between elementary particles. At this level, scientists are like children throwing spaghetti at a wall to see what sticks. The result of this test was inconclusive. They talked about elementary interference, whatever that might be, and the next day, radioactivity in the atmosphere increased exponentially. They assured us that at this distance, the increased radioactivity was not dangerous to humans. But meanwhile, it was no longer possible to communicate through radio signals with the satellites buzzing overhead. Any form of GPS navigation failed, leaving people with outdated paper maps to navigate to work. That is, if they were lucky enough that their parents or grandparents still had those maps lying around, or if they had bought their children an atlas for their geography class. As a result, flights, or even ships crossing the ocean, had become an impossibility. We were effectively grounded in our own countries. Fortunately, communication over landlines was still possible, although these too seemed to be having slight glitches, or at the very least they worked more slowly than usual. This is very frustrating for a process analyst like myself who often works from home. Going on site to talk to my clients was virtually impossible at the moment, at least until the supply of reliable paper maps caught up with the increased demand. So, working from home was the only option, but that is very annoying when every single web page takes over 10 seconds to load, or when video calls constantly drop out and have background noise at all times. Despite this frustration, I paradoxically got more time on hand, since half the world now seemed to be taking up their vacation time until this crisis would be resolved. And I myself could not continue working without input or alignment with the client. The question now was, when would this crisis be resolved? The scientists seemed to have no idea as to what they had actually caused, and without knowing what was going on, it was impossible to resolve it. With only half a population working, the economy grinded to a halt. Deliveries were now either impossible or took an endless amount of time. One could sense a panicky atmosphere on the streets as people began to realize that supermarkets were also barely getting deliveries, making food and other goods like toilet paper scarce. People started hoarding more and more, but then came the problems with the money. We could no longer rely on our bank cards for payment. Due to the delayed internet, timeout errors came up more and more often, so that after a while, people could only pay with cash. The banks, knowing that their whole system of economic overinvestment would collapse like a house of cards, introduced a daily limit for withdrawals of money, limiting both the rich and poor to a living wage. As you might imagine, the more unsavory elements of our society did not put up with this, and crime spread like a plague across the country. I say the country because we could barely glean any news from other countries on the newscasts. I can only assume that the exact same situation occurred everywhere else. Retail workers found this increasing risk of robbery too great to be willing to show up for work anymore, especially when their own wages were no longer insured due to the problems with the banks. When they became desperate enough, they became criminals themselves. Everything only got worse when boredom also started to set in. For a lack of work, people grabbed for the TV, but online streaming services were frustratingly slow if they loaded an episode at all, and the regular TV programming started having less and less to offer while people there also refused to work. Only the newsreel was still reliable every night, because they felt it was their duty to keep the people informed. But they were becoming more and more limited and restricted in the news they could deliver. Books and board games were enjoying a resurgence of popularity, but they were hard to come by if you didn't already own them, and I know of at least one bookstore in the area that was robbed as it went up in flames. Fortunately, at the time, the fire brigade was still working, but they would have a lot of work ahead of them. Tension on the streets was palpable, and distrust was rife. People did not leave their homes unless they had no other choice, and it was no longer even worth the risk to visit a friend if they did not live nearby. I myself reached back to my childhood passion of astronomy. I had brought out my telescope again and peered at the night sky from the roof of my apartment. Normally, I would not have been allowed to enter the roof, but this was the only place where I could immerse myself unseen into this distraction. From the balcony of my flat, I did not dare risk this hobby, because you never knew what the madman on the street would do if they saw you. It was now best not to draw attention to yourself. Through the window would also have been an option, but then the area of the night sky you can see is very limited, and besides, my boyfriend wouldn't like having to turn off the lights all evening just so I could see something outside. So from the roof, I was looking upwards on my own. As a child, my dream was to discover a celestial body or a comet and name it after myself. That dream soon proved to be unrealistic due to our modern sciences and the amazing automated satellite telescopes that mapped everything around us. I realized it would now no longer be impossible to make discoveries, as all communication with those very satellites was cut off. But even if I did discover something, I would not be able to share that discovery with anyone. There was something strange about the night sky, something I couldn't really put my finger on. The stars moved strangely, as if the Earth's rotation was not perfectly round as it should be. But I put this thought in the back of my mind when I noticed, several nights later, that the moon was missing. I was now operating on a minimum of sleep, and when I did sleep I had strange nightmares. Fortunately, the abundance of instant coffee we had in reserve came to the rescue. Possibly this insomnia reinforced my paranoia, for when I started using my telescope to look through the window at the street and the neighbors during the day, I noticed that there were no longer any normal people to be seen. The few specimens who dared traverse the street either remained timidly in the shadows, hoping to remain unnoticed, or they were very loud, drunken men and women who were past the capability of caring about anything anymore, throwing their drama on the street for all to see. couples we thought were quite normal and friendly, but in whom something was now broken. I looked on and saw that all the other neighbors were secretly also watching the drama through their windows. This was the best entertainment we could still hope for. People increasingly turned to drugs to escape this reality, if only for a moment. But even these drugs were hardly supplied. Paradoxically, as a result, people were not frugal with what they had left, but smoked, swallowed, or injected whatever they had before it could be stolen from them. Overdoses were plentiful, which at best ended in a quick death, as hospitals too no longer had the capacity to take care of everyone. At worst, overdoses caused psychoses, where some people violently tried to bite someone else's ear off, or were just generally aggressive. I am sure that despite the lack of news reports, the murder and then mainly suicide rates had skyrocketed. The people were certainly depressed enough. Even my own boyfriend couldn't take it anymore, which made it my job to comfort him and cheer him up, locking my own feelings away. Those wouldn't be helpful here. The world could not take the situation for much longer, and the government was doing its best to somehow shift back to a medieval way of life, where the needs of the people should be met by local production. This is not an easy transition when the entire economy was based on international dependence. The farmers who the government had loaded, and whose production and territory had been restricted year after year, were now considered the heroes who could provide potential salvation, at least until the problem with the radioactive atmosphere was resolved. Then they would no longer need them, and they would be blamed again for the global warming nobody seemed to care about anymore. I must admit that the government's long-term plans might have succeeded in overcoming the crisis, or in enabling the transition to a new way of life. But we didn't have a long term. We had not noticed it due to the intensity of the light, and because we never looked directly at it. But the sun had grown larger. Despite our isolation, rumors still circulated, and once someone finally noticed it, everyone noticed it. People tried not to panic, and sought explanations that made no sense. The most scientific of these was that the increased radioactivity in the atmosphere was possibly bending the sun's rays, making it appear larger than it was, like some kind of huge magnifying glass. These hopes appeased people for a while, until one morning we got confirmation. I had gotten up early, before my boyfriend had woken up, and I tried my luck by turning on the TV in hopes of receiving a signal. The early morning news started, but without the usual intro music, or any kind of production value really. A rather ragged and clearly stressed woman in jeans and a plain t-shirt spoke. When the news team heard the news, they had gone home immediately. Only this woman, who was really just a production assistant, had stayed behind to brief the country. A scientist had given confirmation. The sun was not magnified, but was definitely getting closer. At the rate we were approaching her, the Earth would probably scorch up within 24 hours. This was our last day. I was speechless, immediately looked out the window, and saw that the sun that started peeking over the horizon was indeed at least twice as big as before. I did not panic. On the contrary, I was empty. I felt Nothing now. What do you do on the last day of your life? I had no desires to see friends or family, nor the desire to break the news to my boyfriend, who was still snoring with a frown. We had had such bright future plans. For some time we had been looking for a house to live together, and though it was not yet said aloud, it was clear that it would not be long before we would start making children. Children that we would put everything of ourselves into, who would grow up with our values, our norms, and our genes. With all the virtues and worries, happiness and misery that would come with it, we would have been happy at the end of our lives. Glad that despite our own mortality, we would still partly live on in them, and their children, and their children's children, immortalized by what is passed on from one generation to the next. Now we are really faced with our impending mortality, and suddenly I didn't see the point of him. Why should I still care about him with no future? I was empty. I didn't need support, and I didn't have it in me to give support. You might think we could have still used each other for sex, an expression of procreation as a final middle finger to certain death. And although usually I am fairly aroused at this time of the month, to say the least, now I had no lust for it at all. What was the point anymore? I took his car keys, and some good bottles of alcohol, a candle and a lighter, in case the end comes at night. And for some nostalgic reason that I cannot describe, I also took my telescope. I left him and drove away in his own car. I didn't even leave him a message, because why would it matter anymore? I have no guilt, because why feel guilty when there is not a problem in the world that will matter tomorrow? I drove away with the rising of the sun. At first I didn't know where. I didn't want to see or speak with anyone. So the only thing I knew for sure was that I was leaving town. Not many people were awake yet. A happy side effect when there is nobody working and everyone can always sleep in. But the people that were awake drove like maniacs, no longer caring about traffic regulations. I could avoid them, but I had already seen some deadly accidents. The neighbors would have another show to watch. And at that thought, linked to the telescope I had brought with me, I knew where I would go. There was an old observatory on a big hill an hour or two away. This used to be a classic destination for school trips to learn more about the universe. I am not sure if the huge telescope was even functional at all, but it had a large auditorium upon whose domed ceiling the splendor of the universe could be fully projected. I used to love coming here as a child, and it was certainly part of the reason for my passion for astronomy. Now, at the end, I felt compelled to come back. Strange how a childhood passion, diluted during adolescence when faced with reality, can flare up again so suddenly. The observatory was completely deserted. The doors were locked, but I could break a window to get inside. Not that it helped much, as the building had no electricity. Had the nuclear power plant shut down? It was no wonder that this old building had no solar panels. At least there was still running water. So apart from the alcohol I brought with me, I would have something to drink when the temperature would start to rise. Rather than stay inside in the dark, I decided to set up my telescope outside on the observatory's terrace. In the distance was a large village, or a small town, that the terrace overlooked. With the telescope I had a view of the streets and the people. I could not believe my eyes from the exuberant inhumanity. Clearly not everyone had the same lack of sexual appetite as myself on this day. There were groups gathered in some kind of orgy. Wait, no. The few women present did not seem like they wanted to be there. Or at least not all of them did. This was a group rape session. I did not want to see this terrible sight. But I couldn't pull my eyes away. It was strangely fascinating. I eventually managed to move the telescope, but the rest of what could be seen was not much better. A father jumped down from a building, leaving his children below crying at his corpse. A group of young students surrounded the man, and then each stabbed him with a kitchen knife. It was presumably their teacher. After doing so, some of them vomited and all turned pale. Somewhere else in a courtyard hidden between buildings, a group of people in strange robes or cloaks knelt and prayed. Elsewhere, there was a woman who had somehow obtained a taser, electrocuting an old man. He fell down, but did not appear to be dead. She grabbed his wallet, took a few steps, seemed to remember that money would no longer have any value, and threw it on the ground beside her. In another corner of the city, a man incorrectly recycled a greasy pizza box in the cardboard container, rather than sorting it away with general rubbish. And the most dangerous of all were the many joyriders who made a sport of doing as much damage as possible, or hitting people if they were lucky, before crashing themselves. One of them hit the original group of rapists. When he stepped out afterwards, he seemed to have done so not out of pleasure, but out of justice. He went on to swing a baseball bat in the general direction of the remaining rapists who were fleeing. He then rescued the woman he had not run over and drove off with her. So I watched the city, or the village, while drinking from the bottle I had brought with me, and the hours slipped by. Everyone reacts differently on this last day, but I can understand them all. The social contract has collapsed, and we can do whatever we want now, for we will all be dead before our guilt can stir. I got to know a new side of myself, a side that gets a perverted pleasure from ogling disasters. In other times, this realization would have troubled me. Now, I couldn't care. This distraction, along with the alcohol, is exactly what I need to avoid having to confront my feelings, or lack thereof. I am empty, but this gives me life. Literally, the emptiness is terrible and needs to be fed with something. If I don't, I would no longer be able to suppress the thoughts that I share with the man that had left his children behind. But no, that is a coward's way out, I convince myself. I will observe the human condition on this last day, analyze it, just as I did with my daily work. I will bring order to the chaos, if only for myself. I will follow people with my telescope, give them names, try to understand their motives, and predict what they will do next. In my head, I write a report. The end of the world, and why psychosis is the only logical consequence. The evening advances, and night falls. Because of the alcohol, I begin to fall asleep despite my best intentions. I decide to go back inside, as I am not prepared for the chill of the night. And it might be better not to have to see the sun grow any further before we fall into it. With the earth between us, I won't know exactly when the end will come. A surprising reassurance. I will be able to fall asleep, and I will never have to wake up. As I lose consciousness there in the dark auditorium, I consider, with one last thought, that the temperature has not increased at all. But then I wake up again. Quite groggy, I don't immediately realize where I am. I reach for my mobile phone, but it has no charge left. For a moment I linger in the dark, until the realization dawns upon me. I haven't slept through the end of the world after all. I woke up too early, and despite my hangover, I know I won't fall back asleep anytime soon. I go through the darkness to find a wash basin to quench my alcohol-dehydrated thirst. But then, is that a light? After opening the door of the auditorium, I see light shining in through a window. Is it already daytime? How can this be? We should have crashed into the sun by now. I rush out, and the bright day greets me. A huge sense of happiness embraces me as I see that the sun has returned to its normal size in the sky. This is not the end after all. Granted, humanity has suffered tremendous damage the previous day, but we will be able to rebuild. We have a future again, and thus another hope behind which humanity will be able to unite. I go to the terrace, to my telescope, but even before I can look through it, I suddenly see something out of the corner of my eye that fills me with disgust. There is something big in the town. No, several somethings, as big as elephants. They are hard to describe from afar, but they seem to be big dark brown spheres, and with snapped sticks on the sides. Why did the people build these things? No, wait. Are they moving? I grab my telescope, point it roughly at one of the spheres, and look through it. It's a bit of a search before I really get it into focus. Then, less than a second later, I let out a scream and fall backwards. Ah! The telescope falls on its side. My brain is short-circuited. In my shock, I don't know how long I sat there on the ground. But it must have been at least several minutes. Every time I think back to that image, I feel shudders running over my body, like someone is scratching with their nails across a blackboard. I feel the convulsions in my face calm down. That was not from this earth. What I thought were snapped sticks were in reality some kind of huge, hairy spider legs, far more than 8. The sphere was not really a sphere either, rather egg-shaped, but with several segments, kind of like a skinned orange. I had clearly underestimated them from afar. They seemed to be much bigger than elephants. They had, as I said before, a dark brown color, and their spheres, or eggs I guess, were not smooth. They had a rather uneven surface, with spikes at irregular intervals. Or no, they were more like stingers. This was such a strange sight, moving so unnaturally. I am unsure whether this shell, this exoskeleton, is organic or some kind of perversely deranged spider-like robot. I don't want to see these things again, but I realize I have no other choice. Where yesterday I looked with morbid curiosity, now I'm trying to overcome my instinctive refusal of looking at them, because I know my life may very well depend on it. Finally, I set up my telescope again. I try to look through it, but in its fall, the lens I am looking through, the objective, was broken. Fortunately, I have other such objective lenses in this set to replace it. But of these, the zoom level is too large, so I only get to see a small part of the scenery at a very close range. I try to aim it as best as I can near one of those spider spheres, and coincidentally aim it at the courtyard where the people in strange robes were praying yesterday. They still seem to be praying, as if these are the gods offering them salvation, but they are not. The spider sphere is now running towards them with unnatural acceleration. I see this without a telescope, as that would be too far zoomed in. Looking back through the lens, I see that the people have fallen down, with a hollow crevice in their chests. Oh, there is blood everywhere, and pieces of flesh. One of the corpses, because that is what they are now, corpses and not people. One of the corpses is approached again by the spider sphere. It sticks one of its legs into it again and raises it up. This is all hard to follow because it's in motion, but it looks like some kind of black worms are coming out of several small holes in its leg and nestling themselves under the skin of the corpse. No, it's more like a tentacle than a worm, as they do not detach from the leg. I can barely keep my eyes on this anymore, but I suppress the urge to vomit. The monster lifts the corpse above the segmented egg that now seems to be partially opening. Luckily, the angle isn't optimal, and the telescope is still too zoomed in. Just when I think I get to see what's inside, a kind of blue, purplish steam comes out of it and hits the corpse. When this steam dissipates a little, I am confronted with another horrifying sight. The corpse is, for lack of a better word, melting, dripping into the shell. I immediately look away, losing my balance yet again. Once on the ground, I can no longer suppress the urge to vomit, and I spit up some of the acid from my empty stomach. With the disgusting smell of my own vomit, I realize what the scene must have smelled like. At this, tears spring into my eyes, and I would have screamed uncontrollably if my hyperventilation allowed for that to happen. With great relief, I now faint. My sleep is not peaceful. Circles of sharp teeth open towards me, and as I fall into this lurid, dark maw, I hear a rumbling from deeper inside. With that rumbling I wake up again, but as I open my eyes, it doesn't stop. It comes not from the stomach of some nightmarish beast, but from deep within the earth, as if it's screaming out in pain. Strange, I never knew there to be earthquakes in this corner of the world. I must have slept a long time, because the sun is now hidden behind darkening clouds. Clearly, it's late in the afternoon now. I see, or actually don't see, the city that is no longer there. There are piles of rubble everywhere, as if all the buildings have been demolished, and in the rubble, strange structures, sometimes metallic, sometimes almost organic, seem to stand out. In the middle of the city is a large metal slab, the size of a football stadium. More to the outer edges are several small basins. A reddish liquid bubbles within them. But most striking of all is the large canyon that now cuts through the hills. At its closest point, it is less than 50 meters away from the large central metal plate. Just what exactly is going on here? I dare to use my telescope again, and decide to take a closer look at each of these features, starting with one of the basins. This appears to be a boiling viscous liquid. Blue-purple fumes are steaming off it. Have these monsters made some kind of bath here? Do such beasts care about personal hygiene at all? I look further and see one of the large spider balls appear from behind a pile of rubble to approach the basin. This pile of rubble, now that I pay attention to it, looks very much like an anthill built up to the sky. But that doesn't matter. This is probably just a distraction that my brain makes subconsciously to avoid looking at the monster. However, I force myself to stop this avoidance and to look at it directly. And I see that on 3 spider legs that are sticking upwards, it seems to have impaled a cow. Why hasn't it eaten this snack yet? That question does not remain unanswered for long. He holds the cow above the basin that begins to broil with increased intensity beneath her. I pay close attention to the spot above the surface, and suddenly I see some small, black, insect-like jaws protruding from the water. I am too far away to make out more detail. With a cough of blue-purplish steam over the cow, the spider ball drops her into the pool that now seems much more disturbed. Oh fuck! That liquid must consist of melted people! In no time at all, the cow seems to have been decomposed, torn apart, and relative calm returns to the basin. A little later, when I was just about to look away, I see some kind of insect emerging from the syrup of people. It is maybe roughly the size of a chicken. I call it an insect as the closest approximation I can make. I have never seen anything like it before. It looks like some kind of huge woodlouse or beetle. It crawls over the edge of the pool, and it seems to instinctively head for the canyon. At this thought, I look further towards the canyon, which I now realize has thousands of similar insects running around the walls. My body itches as if they are crawling all over my skin. But still, I force myself to keep looking and notice, after a while, that the ones coming out of the canyon are carrying debris between their jaws and on their backs. They carry it towards the central metal plate, under the supervision of one of the spider spheres. I don't see clearly how, but somehow they deposit the lumps on several little platforms on the edge of the plate. There they seem to be hovering, while starting to glow as they melt into uniform spheres of glowing metal. The non-magnetic earth around this metal either falls down or burns up. Once these glowing spheres of metal meet uncertain criteria, they are shot off as if by themselves towards the center of the platform, where I can see that a kind of huge red-hot needle now stands out against the darkening clouds. Is this some kind of antenna? I don't have time to wonder about this any further, because suddenly I hear a huge bang coming from far above me. I look up and see some kind of huge rough cone falling down from space through the cover of clouds. It burns through the atmosphere with a bright flash, but that doesn't seem to harm it. I shudder as I realize that this is the end, that this cone will hit like a bomb. But as suddenly as it had come, it stops, less than 10 meters above the ground. As far as I can see, this seems to break the fundamental rules of momentum, yet it really is what I see. At the top of this inverted cone are 3 large membranous wings. I call them wings, but they don't flap. Blue flashes glide across their thin membranes. I can only guess that these, with yet another form of magnetism, broke the fall. Now the cone opens along the bottom, and thousands more of beetle-like cockroaches fall down. I surmise that there are many resources in this area, and that the local production or growth of these insects is not fast enough to keep up with demand, so the mothership has sent down more reserves. The mothership. Yes, my brain seems to have skipped a few steps, but there really must be one. This is not a native species of our planet. They are clearly aliens. They must have come here with some kind of spaceship. That explains the radioactive interference in our atmosphere, the whole decay of humanity in the past month. They must have used some advanced technology to create a projection that made it look like the sun was coming towards us. All this so that our entire socio-cultural constructions would collapse, so that we would not be able to mount a coordinated counterattack. This was their plan. And now they're adapting our planet to their needs. This train of thought gets interrupted by a sudden crackle below me. I look over the terrace fence and see one of those cockroach trilobites crawling up the slope. I wish I didn't have to see it so close up. The differences from terrestrial insects are clearer now. The chitin is not fully attached to the body. It is not a whole, like with our insects, but rather seems to be attached to some kind of connecting slime inside. That slime is roughly the same color as the armor, so I had not noticed it from afar. Because these segments are so loose, it can wriggle and bend in all sorts of angles, even stretching over the larger cavities in the wall it is climbing. Panicking, I look for something to throw at it, to keep it away from me. I throw my now useless wallet first. I miss. It is still too far away, but it is fast approaching. I quickly take off my right shoe and make a second attempt. I hit it on the middle of... well, it's not really a head, but I hit it right in the middle of its uppermost body segment, where 2 protrusions, that I previously thought were mandibles, stick out. Success! The upper legs come off the wall. But the rest of the legs do not, and it quickly recovers. As it folds its upper segment back towards the wall, I am all the more aware that indeed it does not have a head, nor does it have any eyes. How does it know where to go? Did it come here purely by chance? In any case, it doesn't matter right now, because it is coming directly for me. I grab the telescope, and just as it comes over the edge, under the fences, I hit its body as hard as I can. I hear a loud, sickening crack, and I hit it again, and again, and again. The chitin is solid, but with all my strength I manage to partially break it. My telescope is beyond all repair. When I lift it one last time, I can see the damage I have done, and some of the slime inside, but also many much smaller insects that are now emerging from its body, from the crack I made, but also from the various openings between its loose segments. I don't understand what I'm seeing, and stand there dumbfounded for the umpteenth time today. These smaller insects seem to be collecting the shards of armor, and are putting them back into place. The slime inside crawls over those shards and hardens like some kind of biological glue. So, are this slime and the armor the same material after all? With my foot that still has a shoe, I kick the thing back over the edge and try to squash some of the remaining tiny insects as best I can. I examine my telescope to see what I can scavenge, and the objective lens that I had just swapped over was not damaged. I take it out to use later as a makeshift binocular. Hopefully, the bug doesn't come back. Night is really starting to fall now. The sun behind the clouds must have disappeared below the horizon. With these binoculars, it is difficult to see details in the city, especially now that it is getting darker, and there are no lights remaining in the city beyond the still vaguely glowing central needle that is starting to get thicker and longer. By now, it must be as big as the tower of a cathedral. Oh, damn! In my fascination, I didn't notice that one of those big spider spheres is running towards me. I can almost hear it already. I cannot solve a confrontation with them with a broken telescope. It is coming straight at me. There is no point in fleeing either, because even with the car it will overtake me. But then an idea springs forth from my mind. A very bad idea that I can hardly imagine will work. But in a crisis, acting fast is essential. I don't have time to come up with a better plan, and I can't embrace death yet. I run inside quickly, cutting my bare foot on the shards of the window I had smashed. I find the still half-full bottle of alcohol back where I had fallen asleep. Then I tear a piece of my shirt and put it through the neck of the bottle, carefully making sure it is well soaked with alcohol. Hurried by the adrenaline pumping through my veins, I run out again, hoping to get to the terrace ahead of the spider sphere. This, however, turns out to be vain hope. A spider leg, or maybe rather a crab leg, now that I see it up close, flies horizontally towards me. Some reflex I didn't know I had makes me dive for the glass on the ground, causing the leg to fly above my head, slamming into the frame of the window behind me. The impact is so great that it partially smashes its way through the wall and seemingly gets stuck. But the monster has more than enough legs left, and I immediately jump back up as another leg comes at me. Where the previous one was a slash, this one forms a stab, and all I can do within this short reaction time is jump backwards against the wall, further away from freedom. As I contemplate in a daze that I should flee back inside, since the monster cannot get through the opening, I am grabbed by something slimy from behind. Some kind of worm-like tentacles had emerged from the leg stuck in the wall and tied me with a firm grip around my waist. With some force, the monster pulled the leg out of the wall, with me bound to it. The sudden acceleration and stop of the leg makes me dizzy. My weight is apparently a burden that the monster barely notices. I can hear my heart pumping in my ears. I realize I'm on the border between life and death as the monster lifts me above its sphere. The segments of its shell now open before me, surely ready to eat me up. I almost give up hope. Almost. I am ready to stop resisting and join the eternal nothingness. How easy it would be to no longer have to live in this hell. But then the segments opened enough to see inside. The most horrifying sight no sickly, perverted human could ever have imagined revealed itself to me. It is not a maw with sharp teeth that wants to swallow me, but dozens, no, hundreds or thousands of pulsating bulbous vesicles nestled in a grid of tiny cavities barely bigger than themselves. They look like huge fish eggs and stink just as well. In the darkness of twilight, I am unsure whether the nauseating hues are blue or flesh-colored. Each of these vesicles has a dark cavity at the top that seems to stare at me. I don't know why, but I am sure that each of them harbors a separate consciousness. The intrinsic revulsion of this trypophobic horror makes me reflexively reach for the improvised Molotov cocktail and lighter I had brought for the candles. The buzzing impression thumps away any sense of acceptance that had been growing within me since yesterday, or rather growing during this entire hellish month. Neither the thought of the solace of death, nor any sense of agonizing self-preservation passed through my mind. Only the full conviction that those things must be destroyed drives me. The vesicles begin to swell collectively, and some of them already puff out their corrosive emissions. Before they have the chance to melt me with their fumes, I light a Molotov cocktail and throw it into the center of the spider sphere. Although it was not the explosion I imagined, the bottle broke, spreading a burning liquid between the vesicles that screamed shrilly like a balloon being released. Their acidic emissions also seemed to catch fire. The worm around me slackens its grip, and I drop first with my chin on the shell of one of the segments, and then with my back on the ground. It is a high fall that knocks the air out of my lungs, and at the very least, I have bruised my ribs. The spider sphere scurries around chaotically, but suddenly seems to stop and collapse, like a doll whose strings have been cut. For a moment I suspect it is going to crush me, but then it falls against the wall of the observatory, and seems to achieve some kind of unsteady equilibrium. I don't allow myself time to recover from my fall. I don't know how they communicate, but when I crushed a smaller insect with a telescope, this spider sphere had come straight at me. Now that I have killed it, since I suspect I have really killed it, another one will come soon. Any security I had before, because they had not yet noticed this place, or because they did not consider it to be of importance, is now lost. I run as best I can to my boyfriend's car. My boyfriend? The man I was going to spend my life with. I haven't thought about him at all since yesterday. How might he be doing? No. I have no time to think of others. Now I must escape, and arm the rest of humanity with the knowledge that these monsters can be killed. They can be felled. It won't be easy, but if we gather the remaining remnants of humanity, there is hope yet that we will be able to repel this invasion. As I drive down the single street from the observatory and turn on my windscreen wiper as it has started to drizzle, my head is spinning with hopeful thoughts and plans of resistance. But somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I know that it's just distraction, to temporarily forget the sight of those blistering vesicles burned on my retina. Before long, a chasm on the road blocks my progress. They have seriously battered the earth, and for me there is no alternative but to continue on foot, though I will make my escape through the woods, on the side of the hill, rather than on the visible road ahead. I think I must have walked several hundred meters through the woods to the next hill. Progress was slow, due to my bruised ribs, my bare foot that had been cut on the shards of glass. I will definitely have to find an apothecary in the next village, so it doesn't get infected. The barely visible path, only dimly lit in the dark of night by the glowing needle behind me, and the increasing rain, for which I don't have the appropriate clothing. You would expect that all of this would have discouraged me, but I was drunk on hope, drunk like a hunter who had just shot rare prey, the feeling of a victorious wolf howling at the moon. The adrenaline even eased the pain of my bruised body. Then suddenly there is a bang behind me, and I turn around. The needle that had grown enormous is shot into the air, clearly with another kind of magnetism. As the needle pierces the night's cloud cover, rays of a late afternoon sun fall through the rip in the clouds. Before I fully realized it is actually still daytime, I am distracted by another sight in front of me. Near the observatory, I had left behind is now a second spider sphere approaching the first. It grabs a hold of it and then climbs above it. It opens both of the segmented shells, and vesicles seem to fall from the new sphere to the old one. Once more I stand there dumbfounded until the cloud cover closes and artificial night falls again. From this distance, barely visible, I would still swear that I saw the first spider sphere moving again in the dark. A new needle begins to form, and with it, I realize that I must also be on my way again. Despite my blood chilling in my veins, I am not ready to give up just yet. I am possibly humanity's last hope. That is the only thought that still drives me. But am I really? What can a single me do? I have no I have no access to nuclear codes. And in fact, I have no access to any other weapons. While coughing, I drive this thought away. First, I will have to find other people and give them hope with the information that the monsters can be wounded. And then we'll have to see. As a tremor roars deep within the earth beneath me, the adrenaline seems to dissipate as pain spreads all over my body. I look at my arms and see rashes as if they were well burned by the sun. And are those holes in my clothes? Oh fuck, this is acid rain. I need to hurry and find shelter. I don't break out into a sprint as the air seems to get thinner higher up the hill. Yet I try to go up as fast as I can maintain. I'm not familiar with the region here, but I seem to remember that there is an old fort from during the World War somewhere around here. From up the hill, I might be able to see the remains of that fort that could possibly serve as shelter. A light glow outlines the summit, so possibly there is a break in the cloud cover that will assist my view up there. A bang, duller and further than the first, goes off to my right. In the distance I see a second needle shoot up to space. Oh no. The realization I was trying to ignore now wormed its way to the forefront of my mind. I had already called it an invading alien force that wants to take over the world. So why then did I assume that this was the only city hit? But I know well enough why. It was the only way I could trick myself into not losing my mind. The only way to keep the thoughts of suicide in check. I am not the heroine who will save humanity. I slow down, but don't stop, as I make my way through the withering woods to the top of the hill on autopilot. Once there, a familiar sight greets me, a scene exactly the same as the village I had left behind, teems with abominations building a third needle. Well, needle is admittedly a misleading image. It was bigger than the biggest skyscrapers they can only build in Dubai. Floating above the metal slab, it was so tall that it protruded through the clouds. This one seemed to be getting ready to launch. Some of the insect-like slime formed an organic clump on the side. A large sucker emerged from it, descending on one of the basins like a mosquito that bites. The bubbling liquid, which must also have been made from humans, was sucked up as if through a straw, filling a bladder growing on the side of the needle. All the giant spider spheres, and presumably the smaller insects that I can't see as well, gather at the sides and start clambering up the floating tower with bridges made out of their own bodies. Not much later, This tower, with the gathered hordes on its sides, shoots up into the sky as it rips open the cloud cover. In the twilight of a now newly falling night, I see a broken moon from which they also seem to have stolen resources. Then I see at least 5 other moons that have non-uniform structures. My head is throbbing like the earth beneath me from the scale of these things that I somehow know to be their ships or nests. Without air resistance in space, an aerodynamic shape doesn't matter. I grab the objective lens that I was still carrying with me in an attempt to see it more clearly. It doesn't help much, but it does help me see countless other needles in the sky, gripped by huge cloud tentacles to be pulled towards the nests. Through the closing gap in the clouds, I see that some of the nests seem to be leaving for deeper recesses of space. Slowly at first, but then accelerating incomprehensibly fast. This is the final straw that breaks my mind. This was not an invasion at all. There was no incredible fight against all odds for the survival of humanity. Toxic hope kept me alive to suffer longer and make no difference. Death would have been a blessing. No one deserves to have survived this torture up till now. They have no interest in living here. For them, this is just a pit stop to refuel before moving on to their terrible true destination. They could have used any planet in our solar system for the resources they needed. But they chose Earth because of its life that would make for a tasty snack to go. I fall to my knees without a will to live on, and my heart spontaneously stops, even before the acid rain can digest me, the poisoned air can suffocate me, or the broken earth can swallow me.